Hey everyone, I'm trying something out new with the audio this time. I'm sorry if there were audio issues with the last one, and also last time um, on the last news update, I wasn't trying to gaslight you guys. I recorded it in two segments, so that's why I said at the end of an hour of me yapping that it was only 35 minutes. So don't worry, I wasn't trying to gaslight you into thinking you spent more or less time with us. Okay, let's get into the news. So, first things first, something interesting on the 21st. We're going to do the 21st to the 27th. In Chernihiv, if we take a look here, there were some UXO, some illegal arms seizures in Chernihiv Oblast, and you can see these are two fuses. They're MVCH62M fuses for TM62 landmines, and I think that is a OZM 72 anti-personnel mine. So you can see that was seized after a guy showed some grenades in an argument. So again, like we had discussed in a previous news update, sometimes heated personal exchanges turn into grenade fights sometimes in Ukraine. Okay, some hot spots along the border. Nothing of note other than I think a logging industry, yeah, a complex kind of got hit over in here. So a forestry business was destroyed. Hotspots on the Sumy border. Again, we want to be thinking of like Esman and Shalahina as a pretty consistent hotspot, as well as like the obvious hotspots along the Sumy-Kursk-Belgorod border, stretching from Unikivska Hromada to Krasnopilska Hromada in the south. Okay, so those are our major hotspots for Sumy. There's nothing too new in terms of developments out of Sumy Oblast that we need to pay attention to right now. So let's move into Kharkiv. So on the 21st in Kharkiv, you can see this concentration. This is all the same story, but just 5 different sources reported on it and didn't give us a specific geolocation. But in Ivashke, on the border, a 24-year-old man, I believe he was either driving a car, no, moped, and he was killed by a human safari drone strike. So just keep in mind, human safari is not just in Kherson; it's all over the place throughout Ukraine. Wherever there's a border, like a natural barrier, whether it be the border or like a river or something like that, Russians will use that to kill civilians. Okay, moving to eastern Ukraine. In Kupiansk, we saw one person injured in shelling on the city, and in Izium, we saw in Horokovatka, there was an airstrike, 2 injuries there, as well as 2 people injured in an airstrike in Petropavlivka near Kupiansk as well. Okay, in Donetsk Oblast, we only had 1 reported civilian casualty. As far as I was aware, it was in Mirnohrad, so we had 1 injured civilian in Mirnohrad. Okay, moving on. Zaporizhzhia, things were relatively normal. The same sort of reporting that we get out of there. Typically, your usual hotspots, so nothing abnormal to report on there. Taking a look at Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, we did see closer to Donetsk in Novopavlivka, because you can see the Russians, they're advancing relatively close to the Donetsk-Dnipropetrovsk border, which starts right about here. Novopavlivka has been hit pretty hard, and same with Mazhova over here. So Mazhovska Hromada and Novopavlivska Hromadas have been targeted by Russian airstrikes recently, and also human safari strikes as well in the rear of Ukrainian lines. So there were no civilian casualties, but just a focus. Okay. Pavlohrad, we saw Shaheds. We also saw Shaheds in Pidhorne and in Dnipro itself. Taking a look along the Dnipro, in Nikopol, there were 3 different incidences where civilians were injured. 2 civilians were injured by artillery shelling, and then another civilian was injured via a Russian landmine. So keep in mind, right, Nikopol was never captured by the Russians. So in order for there to be a Russian landmine there, it would need to be remotely placed there by a drone. So we're getting remote mining via Russian drone starting to be reported here, which I've always suspected that that's been happening as long as it's been happening in Kherson, which is like about 8 months now, I think, that that's been going on. Almost a full year, really. But for it to be reported in Nikopol, that's more or less new. Okay. Doesn't mean that it hasn't been happening before, but it's the first official report of it. Okay, taking a look in Kherson, we had on the 21st, we had 1 injured via a drone strike in Novo-Alexandrivka up here. And we had 1 person killed and 2 people injured in Bilazerka down here. And we had 1 person injured in Antonivka in a drone strike, and we had 2 people injured via artillery shelling in Zelenivka up here and Dnipropetrovsk Rayon down here. Okay. That does it for Kherson Oblast. We did get reports out of Mykolaiv of missile strikes on Mykolaiv city, but it didn't specify the location, obviously, for operational security purposes. And you want to prevent the enemy from having accurate battle damage assessments so they don't hit you again if they didn't destroy the target, or you don't want to let them know that they did or didn't destroy the target either way. Okay. Odessa Oblast, if we're taking a look, we saw 3 people injured on the 21st in Odessa on strikes across the city via Shahed drone, as well as Shahed strikes in Poltava and Cherkasy. Okay. Let's take a look at the 22nd now. So on the 22nd, let's start in Chernivtsi. So in Chernivtsi, and it's actually in Vinnytsia too, this was taking place in both oblasts. A citizen from an EU country, it was unspecified, it didn't specify which EU country the citizen was from, or the man was from, but he is suspected of planting IEDs in Vinnytsia and Chernivtsi, hoping to destroy railway infrastructure and logistics. So the Russians are using civilians to commit terror attacks to try and disrupt logistics. So we see those terror attacks and espionage going on here with improvised explosive devices. So usually these people are recruited via social media and then kind of coached through how to build a device, and then they carry out the attack at the direction of Russian special services. So that's a major problem. It targets not only young children, but also, like in this case, people from countries outside of Ukraine to then come to Ukraine and carry these attacks out. So that's concerning. Okay, in Kyiv, we saw Shahed strikes focusing on Bucha and the general area there. In Chernihiv, we saw drone strikes, geolocated drone strikes along the border here, but in Horodnya, I think it's Horodnyanska, Hromada, somewhere within there were also reported drone strikes, specifically destroying farm equipment. So we can see a Ukrainian farm loaf and then a tractor were destroyed. Okay, taking a look at Sumy. In Sumy, we have our typical hotspots, right? We have Esmanska, Shalahinska, Yunikivska, Miropilska, Krasnopilska. We know all about that. In terms of new developments that we started to see, reports from the General Staff and Sumy ODA of airstrikes on Vorozhba and Bilopilia, which is a sector that has been pretty quiet, but I don't think it's as quiet as it's being reported, whereas this is obviously much more active over here. Nothing really to note there. Okay, Kharkiv. a lot went on in Kharkiv on the 22nd. So in Shahed strikes, and there were Molnias involved too. It's not just Shaheds. It's like a mix of drones. Like, so you get some decoys, you get some Molnia drones, you get some Garan 2 drones kind of flying in and attacking the air defense apparatus at a lot of different levels, right? Like each of those drones is very different in terms of how you intercept it sometimes, or in terms of how it appears on radar. Sometimes you could be shooting down a decoy when you could be shooting down something carrying an explosive warhead or something. So there were massive strikes all across the city. We saw 11 people injured across the city. And in addition to that, we saw a drone strike also in Vovchanska Hromada, up in this area. A 28-year-old man was injured. And then we saw a drone strike in Kupiansk as well, which injured one person. And then there were 5 people injured in airstrikes all across Kupiansk as well. So a pretty bad day overall in Kharkiv Oblast. I think it was 18 total injured there. In Donetsk Oblast, if we take a look here, let's bring up our daily totals. So in Mirnohrad, we had 3 killed and 4 wounded. Ekonomichne, there was 1 killed. Pokrovsk, 1 wounded. Dovobalka, 1 wounded. And Ivanopilia, there was 1 injured as well. So, and as you can see, I'll just like a point of maybe interest to some of you. This is keeping account since the beginning of the war for Donetsk Oblast. So 3,154 confirmed civilians killed and 6,967 civilians confirmed wounded. So that's just, I think, an interesting thing. There is no other oblast that really releases this kind of statistic in this format, which it's very helpful in terms of keeping track of war crimes as best you can, because obviously there's hundreds, if not thousands, of civilian casualties that we do not have the ability to count because of the nature of the front line. Okay. Beyond civilian casualties in and around Pokrovsk and approaching Konstantinivka, as we're approaching Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, we saw in Mzhova and Novopilska significant airstrikes, injuring 2 people. And then moving along the Dnipro, we also saw 2 people injured in shelling on Nikopol, and 1 person injured in Pokrovka, right, Hromada. So Pokrov right there, and then Pokrovska is like a tiny little town there, but within this area, there was 1 other civilian casualty. Okay. In Zaporizhzhia, we had a significant event. So the 22nd was pretty bad between Kharkiv getting slammed by Shaheds and these airstrikes that we now have on Zaporizhzhia. In Zaporizhzhia, 2 people were killed. Both, I think it was a 55-year-old woman and a 67-year-old woman were killed. And a dog was injured. The dog's owner was one of the women who died. And so there's some pictures. I can't show them here because of the nature of them and what YouTube likes and doesn't like. But they're pretty sad. The dog almost lost his eyes because of the shrapnel. So some of the pictures are pretty rough, as well as like the dog wouldn't leave the body of his owner. So that was pretty heart-wrenching to see. But in total, 2 Fab 500s were dropped on this apartment building, which I'll point out specifically which one it was. It's this one right here. I know I kind of drew it out over the whole area, but I can't stack 40 markers on one apartment building or else nobody will be able to read anything. So it's this building right here that got hit. That one, that strike alone killed 2 people and injured another 47 children in that strike were injured as well. Okay, moving to Kherson. Okay, across Kherson Oblast, we saw 22 casualties, which it was a pretty horrific day, mostly due to drone attacks and artillery shelling across the city. So in first Bilizerka, let's talk about that. We saw drones wounding 2 people, and then inside Kherson itself, we saw drones wounding at least another 6 people, and then wounding 2 more medics after an ambulance was attacked. And then across all of Kherson as well, just the city, another 10 people were wounded by shelling of various kinds. On this day, there were no airstrikes, so I'm assuming it's all barrel artillery. We didn't get any MLRS reports either, so I'm assuming it's all just either 122 or 152 millimeter artillery shells. Actually, no, we did get one airstrike reported. Oh, no, it was a previous injury. It was a previous reporting. So keep that in mind as well, right? Like we talked about those airstrikes in Kherson on the 16th and the 17th. Sorry to interject and interrupt our train of thought, but you're also getting casualties reporting from previous events too, all while this is happening at the same time. So, yeah. 22 casualties that day. 10 wounded, 3 of which were police officers. Moving to Odessa. Again, not to skip over Mykolaiv, there aren't usually casualty events out of here. It's usually just FPV strikes, but we do occasionally find some. We did have a public geolocation of a drone strike here, Shahed drone strike, which wounded 2 individuals in Odessa. Okay, let's talk about the 23rd. So on the 23rd, we'll start in Rivne. We don't often go to Rivne, and I don't often map anything. Not much happens in terms of police reports, but this was kind of a lot for one day, especially for Rivne. There were 2 boys injured by UXO. On the same day. So it was like a variety of things. Like one of the boys picked up a lithium battery and tried to open it with a knife, and I think that exploded, and I think he lost his hand. Yeah. Oh, 3 of his fingers. And a firecracker. A boy lost 2 fingers. And then in Kyiv, another unexploded ordnance or like kind of grenade related incident. We saw a car exploded randomly in Podilsky Rayon, but after investigation, it was found that a 41-year-old man threw a grenade outside of his window, and it randomly landed on the car and blew up. So false alarm there. We also saw Shahed strikes on Borispil in Kyiv. In Sumy, we had geolocation of Tornado, so Smerch, MLRS, but the Smerch MLRS strike was reported by the Sumy ODA as missiles, not as MRL. So that I would assume I would go with the geolocation rather than the military administration's reporting in this case. I think we're more likely to believe the footage rather than the report there, because they are different, right? Like keep in mind, right? MRL is not a cruise missile necessarily. So okay. Doesn't mean that they can't fire him sometimes, but that's MRLS. Or MLRS. Sorry, can't speak. All right, border activity. Pretty significant. We saw Russian claims this week also of like pushing Ukraine completely out of Kursk. As far as we can tell, that's not true yet. Might be true in the future, but not true yet. So let's go on to Kharkiv. So in Kharkiv on the 23rd, we also saw 2 boys, young boys, injured by UXO. So a 13-year-old boy was trying to make a homemade IED, and it actually blew up in his hand. So not sure if that was part of maybe like a Telegram recruitment process or something like that. But as you can see, not a good idea to build IEDs. Do not do it. Okay, 17-year-old boy was injured by shrapnel as well when he was walking in the forest in this area. His clothes caught on a branch and it triggered the explosion of a device. So maybe some kind of grenade hooked up to a tripwire of some kind, and he was wounded there. We saw Shahed strikes on Kharkiv. We saw Molnia strikes as well. There was one person injured. We saw Molnias kind of all over the place. In Chuhuyev is where we had the casualty, but all the way up over here in Purdyanka. Okay, Kupiansk, we also saw shelling and drone strikes, and we saw in Prikolotne 3 people were injured by drone strikes as well. So I think, yeah, one was a 19-year-old girl, and I believe there was a 54-year-old woman and then another man who was injured as well in one of the reports. Okay. After Kharkiv, let's talk about Poltava. In Poltava, we saw a significant amount of strikes geolocated roughly to this area via Garan 2, Shahed 136 drones. In Donetsk Oblast, we saw a significant amount of civilian casualties again. 2 killed in Konstantinivka, as well as 2 injured. In Slovyansk, 1 killed and 1 injured. In Kramatorsk, 1 injured. In Chernichivka, 1 injured. In Dovhabalka, 1 injured. And 1 other injured in Mirnohrad as well. Okay, most of those, as you can tell from the markers, right, we're talking mostly about in the Pokrovsk area, but you are also seeing sort of like just south of Konstantinivka as the Russians are pushing out of Toretsk and out of Chasiv Yar, kind of pinching Konstantinivka on this sort of like wider section of front. So you're seeing like a lot of MRL and airstrikes on these areas, as well as your usual focus on like the major population centers like Slovyansk or Kramatorsk. Okay. Talking about Dnipropetrovsk next. On the 23rd, we had a pretty significant event happen. This is something I briefly referenced when I was recording the last weekly review on the 23rd, and I've referenced this before as well in terms of human safari strikes occurring along the riverbank here. But we saw in Marhanets, right here is where it happened. Again, I can't stack markers, so I try and get them in the same area roughly. We saw a total of 9 people killed and 58 injured due to a Russian drone strike on a bus. I cannot show the pictures of this because it was really gruesome. So, it's one of the worst autobus. I'm translating the Ukrainian word literally to English in my head. It was one of the worst civilian transport strikes that I've seen since tracking the human safari. It is the worst one, I'll say that. It's worse than any one that we've seen officially reported out of Kherson in terms of death toll. I have heard reports of like some of the Kherson bus strikes, like rising in death toll, and they're not official reports. They're like, it's anecdotal information for the most part. So you do have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. But in this case, we can definitively say this is the deadliest bus strike with a drone so far in the war, as far as I'm aware of tracking. Like in my own tracking, that's the deadliest one. It's the worst one. It's the scenes are just, it's unspeakable how gruesome the scene was. And from my understanding, they were all workers at a mine, from my understanding, or some sort of industrial facility. So vital civilian workers killed on their way to work, massacred, absolutely massacred. It was disgusting. In Nikopol as well. It's like the depravity didn't end there. In Nikopol, they also wounded three more people, one of them being a 23-year-old mother and her two kids. Now, she's 23, fairly young mother. She had two very young children, a 3-year-old toddler and a 1-year-old, or barely approaching 1-year-old, was injured by an FPV drone strike. So the Russians are literally trying to kill babies with drones. Proof. Right here. Proof. Russians kill babies with drones, or try to. They hunt babies, they hunt kids with drones. That's what the Russians do. Let's talk about Kherson. So, in Kherson, we saw two emergency workers wounded through via a UXO strike in Chudolubivka, as well as 8 people injured across Kherson itself. Now, that was 2 people wounded from drone strikes in Antonivka. We saw 1 person wounded from a drone strike in Komishane. We saw 2 wounded people in Kherson itself from FPV drone strikes or drone drops, skid drops. And then artillery shelling also wounded another 2 people within the city itself. And unfortunately, a 81-year-old man was found to have been killed at some point within the last week by a Russian strike, and they discovered his body in Romashkova on that day. Which leads me to this next point. So, like, in discovering civilian casualties, right? In the last week, in Kherson alone, they discovered the body of a 51-year-old woman in Antonivka, who they presume was killed on April 12th. They found a man who was injured on April 16th, a 52-year-old man in the central part of Kherson. He came forward to receive medical treatment, but couldn't because of the drone threat and the artillery threat. As well as on April 17th, it became known that there was a 58-year-old man in Dnipropetrovsk district who came forward at some point this week with his injuries. So another casualty from those airstrikes and artillery strikes on the hockey rink and the apartment building that we saw last week. And then on the 18th, in addition to the 81-year-old person in Romashkova, there was a 64-year-old woman who came forward having been wounded by Russian drone strikes as well. And then 2 people in Bilizerka, a 50-year-old man and a 40-year-old woman, who were both injured by shelling in Bilizerka as well. And then on April 20th, a 65 and a 53-year-old man, both from Antonivka, came forward with injuries from drones and shelling. And as well as, I missed another person on the 18th, a 33-year-old man from Kherson. So just, a dozen people that were not reported on the normal daily reports that are coming forward like weeks later with injuries, or several days later with injuries. So I think it's important to understand that the daily official casualty reports, right, are maybe only capturing a certain amount of the real total, and over time we will find more people were injured later back and never came forward. Some people may have died from their injuries too, and we just don't know about it. We have no way to know until later, whenever that may be. So let's talk about the 24th now. On the 24th, let's go to Zhytomyr. Zhytomyr, we saw Shahed strikes, and that injured a 39-year-old emergency response worker. And the 24th was also the day of massive massive, massive missile strikes and drone strikes all across Ukraine. Let's see if we can zoom in here. So there's a couple hotspots within Kyiv where we saw a lot of the focus. So most of the civilian casualties occurred within this area as far as geolocations told us. But we ended up with 13 people killed as of right now, and at the very least 90 wounded, and 124 other people were treated for psychological or needed psychological assistance because of the horrific loss of their home, their loved ones, whatever circumstance they may have found themselves in after these terror attacks. Okay, in addition to that, some good things happened. I mean, it's not good, but I mean, it's, I don't know, silver lining, if you will. But we saw 2 kittens were rescued and a hedgehog, like the hedgehog. So, some animals were rescued, even though we saw children killed in Sviatoshinsky. So, taking a look at Kyiv overall in terms of what got hit and where, we know that there were strikes in Bucha, which resulted in civilian casualties. We also saw strikes in Vyshhorod over here, which also caused issues with power supply because that's one of the major infrastructure nodes within Kyiv in terms of where power is generated. We also saw in Holosivsky Rayon, there's also major power infrastructure over here as well. So that could have been a target potentially, because we know the Russians are trying to knock out power grids and destroy civilian homes. As well as, okay, strikes on Pechersky and Solomyansky, and yes, Brovary as well. Okay, causing some fires. All right, in Sumy, nothing really to mention out of the normal, right? Like, we have our traditional hotspots, nothing abnormal there. One interesting event that we did see was a relatively deep strike into Sumy Oblast with Shahed 136 Garan 2 variant drones, which caused 2 civilian casualties in Nedrihayliv. Okay. And we also saw, again, this was the day of massive strikes across all of the cities of Ukraine. In addition to Kyiv, Kharkiv was hit. In Kharkiv, we saw 6 people wounded from the combined Shahed missile strikes across the whole city. We also saw in Slobozhanska 1 person wounded from artillery shelling, as well as 1 person wounded in a strike on Shestakova, and 2 people wounded by a MRL, strike on Nechvolodivka. Okay. Beyond that, getting into Donetsk Oblast, let's take our civilian casualties here. Mirnorod, 1 killed, 1 wounded. Yorova, 1 killed, 1 wounded. And Nikoforivka, 1 wounded. Most of that was due to airstrikes on those areas. So we can see airstrikes on Yorova, airstrikes in Liman, airstrikes in Slovyansk, airstrikes in Kramatorsk, airstrikes in Druzhkivka, right? Yablonivka, Alexandro Kalinove, and others. So mostly our civilian casualties right now are being caused by that. Specifically, I would say I can't show all of it, but there might be, yeah. You can see a crater from an airstrike here in Pokrovsk. There's a video of, I think it's like a 4 or 5 minute long video. If you guys are interested, go to the source and check it out. I think it was from, yeah, the MVS. I think the Ukraine National Police put out a video as well. Same video, so you can watch it there as well, of an evacuation operation. They come under drone attacks as well, like throughout the process of like going door to door, checking if people are there, evacuating people. So you see like they have to take cover every now and again. So the civilian evacuation operations after the airstrikes and after the artillery shelling and barrages, MRL strikes, are coming under drone attack afterwards. So you have to be really careful in terms of the evacuation process now. Okay. Nothing of note within Zaporizhzhia other than there was some Shahed activity. Nothing crazy there. And we did see one FPV strike, which unfortunately did kill a 37-year-old driver in Primorska. So we do see occasional human safari style attacks near the front line there. In Dnipropetrovsk, looking a bit further north, we saw Pavlohrad was also targeted in this sort of missile Shahed barrage across the country. In Pavlohrad, we saw no civilian casualties, but in Novopavlivka, we did actually see one civilian casualty from airstrikes there. And if we take a look at Nikopol, we saw 2 civilian casualties from shelling and drone strikes there, as well as 2 civilian casualties in Pokrovska. Okay, let's talk about Kherson. In Kherson, first, let's talk about Shliakova. Okay, this tiny little town outside of Beryaslav, Shliakova. There were 3 police officers wounded by a drone strike on a checkpoint and their vehicle there, as well as 2 casualties in Bilizerka, one being from shelling, another being from UXO, as reported by the Kherson police on their website, but not by any official Telegram channels. And there was 1 civilian casualty in Havrilivka as well, a 60 or 61, depending on the source, year-old person was wounded and then evacuated from the settlement. So you can actually watch the video of that evacuation from the patrol police if you're interested. Okay, that is the 24th. All right, let's talk about the 25th. So on the 25th, let's go to Rivne. All right, in Rivne, we saw a 15-year-old girl from Rakitne was recruited by, or attempted, the Russians attempted to recruit her, but she refused and gave instructions to law enforcement and SBU, and ended up receiving an award for her patriotism and her correct action. So again, the preventative classes that the National Police have been doing, they go around to the school children throughout Ukraine and kind of educate them on how Russian special services are attempting to recruit them and use them for various purposes, mostly for terror attacks. But we're seeing that is working. There are kids that are turning in information to the authorities to stop those. Okay, good news. Now let's talk about Sumy. Some not so good news. Let's go to Oktyrka. So in Oktyrka, we saw a Shahed strike on this facility over here, on these apartment buildings and this neighborhood over here. But I also think there's a private business of some kind over here as well. In those strikes, only 1 person was injured, but it's a wooded area. So were some squirrels. There were like a whole bunch of baby squirrels that are, they're okay now, but they were shaken up by the strike. I think maybe knocked out of their nest by the strike. But they're all safe now. So we had 1 civilian casualty, several squirrel casualties, but I think everybody is okay. Okay. Typical hotspots. Nothing reported that was sort of abnormal on the news front. In terms of Kharkiv, we saw Shahed strikes across the city again. So back to back, Kharkiv getting hit, or back to back to back, Kharkiv getting hit by Shaheds. 3 people were wounded there. One thing that I see like reports coming out of this area every now and again, it's something I've seen after tracking it the last year. There's a lot of animals that people had to abandon when the Russians began advancing back in May of 24 when they first got into Vovchansk. So when that happened, there was like a lot of farm animals that need feeding, and they're still there. They got left behind. So currently, there's lots of volunteers that go there and feed the animals. We do see sometimes these volunteers actually are attacked by Russian drones occasionally, but police officers and volunteers deliver hay to the horses. They feed dogs and other farm animals and pets that have been unfortunately left behind by people that were running away from a Russian invasion. Okay, Shahed strike in Prikolotne as well. And we are on to Donetsk Oblast because I don't think we saw anything out of the norm. Just some airstrikes along the Kupiansk direction, so nothing crazy. Okay, taking a look at Donetsk here's there we go. It's kind of buried there. Sorry. So our civilian casualty report for Donetsk Oblast in Yorova, due to, again, airstrikes that have really focused on Yorova this week. We see a lot of attention on kind of like the Liman direction as the Russians, just to kind of contextualize this, right? The Russians are attempting to push out of Terny and trying to take over Nova, interdict this highway like we talked about last time. I get the impression that this is sort of a vital node kind of in here, like Novoselivka and Chandroholova. So and these woods seem like they would be a good place to put artillery or air defenses. So I could see potentially why this forest strip could get some attention from Russian airstrikes. But these Russian airstrikes are just hitting civilian homes and killing people. So something to keep in mind. So yeah, 2 people killed in Yorova, 1 injured. In Alexeyevo-Druzhkivka, we had 2 people injured. In Zakitna, 1 person injured, and Mirnohrad, 1 person injured. So Zakitna is right here. We also had a report of a person who was injured earlier in Yampil, but there was no official report of an airstrike in Yampil. So I don't know when she was injured. It could have been a while ago, but we did see that. Kramatorsk, Alexeyevo, Druzhkivka, Konstantinivka. Okay, cool. Zaporizhzhia. Let's talk about Zaporizhzhia. So we have a 67-year-old man injured by a Russian drone attack in Orikhiv, as well as yes, two sort of like civil events that we can talk about here. Children in Zaporizhzhia right now. There's over 1,000 preschool children that are going back to remote learning, offline learning. Returning from remote learning, going to offline learning. So it's really important that these children are back in person in education to develop those necessary social skills, and to make up for lost time and missed learning goals. So we're seeing now in Zaporizhzhia, because they've been able to stabilize the situation in terms of like air defense and protect the kids, and with the construction of underground schools being accelerated throughout the city, we're also seeing the ability for more kids to go back and actually have those vital learning experiences that are necessary. So 21 kindergartens are now working full-time, as well as 91 preschools. And they're really focusing on trying to get the young kids in first, because there's so much development that goes on socially at that stage, that those kids really need to be able to form bonds with other kids and their teachers. Okay. In addition to that, we saw, hundreds of civilian casualties throughout Zaporizhzhia, from the Shahed strikes, the missile strikes, the glide bomb strikes. That really creates a massive amount of the population that need accommodations, that have disabilities. So Zaporizhzhia is definitely going to struggle with rehabilitating all of these people and adding infrastructure to their city to accommodate for injuries. And this is true for most cities in Ukraine because of war wounded, but now also civilian casualties in places closer to the front line where that get hit much more. So we've seen lots of people going to physical therapy and rehabilitation facilities. Specifically, these people, they did sort of like an interview with a 34 and a 59-year-old person who were both injured earlier this year on January 8th. And that's good that we're seeing physical therapy and rehabilitation for victims of Russian aggression. Okay, in Dnipropetrovsk, we saw 2 people injured in Novopavlivka. Airstrikes here. We saw as well 3 people killed and 15 wounded in Pavlohrad. So this was from a public geolocation. We know it occurred right about here. Actually, a D-Tech, an energy technician, and his daughter were killed in the strike. Unfortunately, his 15-year-old daughter was killed along with him. The wife survived, as far as I know. So we saw Shahed strikes there on Pavlohrad. So Pavlohrad's been hammered this week. We also saw in Samar, Dnipro, and Kamyanska. So in Kamyanska, we had 1 person killed and 4 wounded, and I didn't see any civilian casualties reported out of Samar. In Nikopol, we saw 1 person killed and 3 people wounded in drone shelling and MRL strikes across the city. And in Kherson, we saw 5 people wounded in drone strikes across the city, as well as we saw some airstrikes, some glide bomb strikes, and there was 1 reported missile strike, but it didn't say where it hit. So I just put it out there. That doesn't mean it actually hit there, but there was apparently a missile that hit somewhere in Kherson Oblast. But for operational security reasons, obviously, you're not gonna hear it. So, and I believe no casualties. No casualties. Okay, so just our typical FPV shelling, or FPV strikes. Sorry. Okay, let's talk about the 26th. So on the 26th, let's start in Kyiv, south of Kyiv in Bilitserkva. We saw a public geolocation gave us the location of a strike here. Shaheds wounded 1 person there. And we also saw Shahed strikes near Boryspil as well in Kyiv Oblast. Taking a look at Sumy, we have our typical hotspots, but not looking so hot. So why is this? Well, in the aftermath of the Palm Sunday strike, right, that we talked about in the last video, the head of the Sumy ODA has been replaced. Now, in the head of the Sumy ODA being replaced, they have also now changed their format for reporting shelling, civilian casualties, all that stuff. It's a different person as far as as far as I'm aware. Based on just how they present the information, it is completely different and honestly not as useful, not as good. It makes my life a lot more stressful and it's a lot harder to kind of understand exactly where events are happening, because they might just say like, oh, there is shelling in Shostka Rayon, which it's like, yeah, so Shostka's over there. I can infer that the shelling happened somewhere along the border, but the border of Shostka Rayon runs from Shalikhina to the top. So like that doesn't help me. That doesn't narrow anything down. So just understand, right, like the mapping for Sumy in terms of the ODA, what they're reporting, it's going to be a lot more hectic. Where you're going to get more accurate reporting for sources out here is going to be like the general staff. They've also changed, like we talked about recently. General staff is way more accurate in terms of the location of events. So that's why Sumy looks empty. It's not because there weren't events here. It's because the reporting has changed with the administrative changes. Like you can even look at the 27th. It's mostly fire reported by the DSNS. If you look at the border, right, it's almost naked. So it's just not what it was, which is unfortunate. Because now it's a little more murky for us in trying to understand what exactly is going on where. All right, 26, we saw power infrastructure disrupted across Poltava Oblast after we saw Shahed strikes in Mirhorod, not Mirnorod, Mirhorod. It's different. Okay. In Kharkiv, we saw public geolocations of strikes near Dehachi, and in those we had 3 people wounded. In Kupiansk, we saw people wounded by Russian airstrikes across the city. 1 person killed and 4 people wounded in Kupiansk. And then if we go to the south in Kupiansk-Vezlovi, we saw 2 people wounded in airstrikes and shelling there. Okay, let's talk about Donetsk Oblast. Oh, that's an in memoriam. Here we go. Nope. Not what I wanted. Not what I wanted. There we go. Okay. So on the 26th of April, we saw in Konstantinivka 2 people killed, 7 wounded. In Novoekonomichne, we saw 1 person killed and 4 wounded. In Zorya, we saw 1 person killed and 1 wounded. In Nikhanorivka, we saw 4 people wounded. And in Seversk, we saw 1 person wounded. So just keeping in mind, right, Seversk up here. We see Konstantinivka right there, as well as Zorya right here. Nikhanorivka is up here, although I guess it's Zaporizhzhia too as well, but Nikhanorivka. And we have Novoekonomichne right there. Okay. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, we saw airstrikes on Novopavlivka and on Mezhovka. Mezhova. Mezhovska Hromada. There we go. In Mezhova, there was 1 person wounded. We saw strikes again on Pavlograd with Shaheds, killing 1 person, wounding another. In Kamyanska, we saw Shahed strikes again, killing 1 person and wounding another 6 people. And we saw Shahed strikes as well on Dnipro, which wounded 1 person. In Kherson, near Chervony Mayak, Red Lighthouse is what that translates to. I like that name particularly. I like this town. So in Chervony Mayak, we saw 1 person wounded by shelling. In Biliserka, we saw another person wounded in artillery shelling that focused on the village, as well as 2 people wounded in Komishani. and one person wounded in Antonivka, those three being FPV casualties. So we see, or skid drop casualties as well. And we saw strikes as well via Shahed or Gerantu across Kirovrad. So in Kropivnitsky and in Lipnizhanka. That's an interesting one. That one kind of hard to say. It's a little hard to say. All right, let's talk about the 27th. First, in Zhytomyr, we saw one person wounded in a drone strike on Zhytomyr, which also caused massive fires throughout the city. We also see, again, right, the bare border. Your typical hotspots still show up on general staff reporting, but for Sumy, it's not ideal in terms of what we're getting for information. A lot more quiet, but definitely not quiet in terms of the combat activity that's going on there. Just reporting's quiet. In Kharkiv, let's take a look. We saw in Kupiansk, there was a doctor who was hunted by Russian drones and attacked. Their vehicle was destroyed. The doctor was injured. I believe it was like a 39 or something, 35-year-old local doctor. So keep in mind, this is also something we've seen in Kherson, right? September 2nd, 2024, there was a oncologist killed in Kherson by a drone strike on their car that specifically was following them, targeting them because of who they were, because they were a doctor. So I think this is similar. I think we're seeing something very similar here. Russian drone pilots stalking doctors, stalking medical personnel, stalking police, stalking civilians, and trying to kill them with drones. Human safari. All right. Additionally, a cab strike on Kupiansk also wounded 2 people. In Donetsk, we saw civilian casualties in Konstantinivka, 3 people killed and 5 wounded. So as Toretsk has fallen and Chasiv Yar is basically fallen as well, right? The pressure now is on Konstantinivka. And as you can tell, this week, day after day after day after day, it's 2 to 3 killed and 3 to 5 wounded every single day that are being reported here. So it is an absolute bloodbath in Konstantinivka right now. And there are people being evacuated actively out of the combat zone, but still, it's a sizable city that's being razed to the ground with MRL and FAB and CAB strikes. Okay. In Nova Ekonomichna, we saw 2 people killed as well, closer to Pokrovsk, just outside Mirnohrad, up here. And we also saw in Zarichna, this is far to the north, in Zarichna, we also saw 1 person wounded. Okay. Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In Novopavlivka, we saw 1 person killed by an FPV drone strike. So we are also seeing human safari strikes appearing in Novopavlivka and Novopavlivska Hromada, as well as Mazhova and Mazhovska Hromada. So just keep an eye out for that. That's going to be something that happens much more often. We also saw Shahed strikes on Pavlohrad and civilian casualties there. We saw civilian casualties increased to 3 killed, 18 injured from our previous total of 3 killed, 15 injured the previous night. And we also saw Verbivska and Slavhorod come under Gerantu strikes, as well as Dnipro itself. In Nikopol, we saw drone, MRL, and artillery shelling all throughout Marhanets, Nikopol, and Pokrovska Hromadas. In Nikopol itself, we saw 1 person wounded by a human safari FPV drone strike. In Kherson, mostly, actually, it was just in Kherson itself, we saw 5 people wounded, mostly by drones, but we did also see airstrikes in Dnipropetrovsk Rayon occur as well. And our last item for today is Odessa. In Odessa, we saw a Shahed drone strike wound one person on the 27th. So that is another week of news for you guys, focusing mostly on civilian casualties and some of the other stories that you won't necessarily hear about, or definitely won't hear about in the Western media. Hopefully, the audio issues are resolved this time around. I'm constantly working on trying to figure out how to best deliver a good product for you guys so that it's worth the listen. I know these are long, so I do appreciate it. And as always, make sure you're keeping up on things with myself and Andrew. You can follow me at Kelly7622 on X. That's where I do my Kherson Weekly when I can. I mean, I haven't done it yet this week, but I'm going to do it soon. Kherson Weekly, where I track the human safari in Kherson week by week. Every weekend, I usually put out an article. And you can keep following Andrew for his loss lists whenever he has the ability to destroy some of the backlog and give you guys like 30 or 40 days all at once in a nice big lossless burger. All right. So that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you guys. Take care.